NATO's big deception, the US, deceived the Eastern European countries of the former socialist camp by admitting them to NATO. It is possible that these countries are the next in line to fight against Russia, while the Americans are not going to actually protect them any more than they are going to protect Ukraine. The US openly says that it supports the intention of its allies to get involved in a war with Russia, but it is not going to go to war with Moscow because it is too dangerous without the involvement of the American Navy, Air Force and nuclear forces, the latter in the form of a threat. The whole of Europe, not just Eastern Europe, cannot go to war with Russia. The US motivates its position by the fact that Russia has not attacked any NATO country, and therefore it is impossible to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. But we know very well that the Americans decide who attacked whom based on their own interests. If they wanted to go to war, they would immediately see Russian aggression. Young NATO members do not want to believe that they have been so rudely used and are still looking for the threshold at which the USA will enter the war. But the US does not plan to go to war with Russia. They are planning to fight China, because China is orders of magnitude inferior to the Americans in terms of the number of nuclear warheads and means of delivery, but not with Russia. Eastern European members of NATO simply did not pay attention to the fact that when they were admitted to the bloc, it was meant that NATO would protect them and defeat Russia by the very fact of their admission. Since the plan did not work, the Eastern Europeans will have to clean up the mess themselves. The US can help with weapons if there is still something left after supplies to Ukraine and reservations for Taiwan. They can throw some money and instruct Western Europe to give more, but they categorically refuse to fight, and rightly so. It is Vilnius, Riga and Warsaw that should burn in order for Washington to prosper, not the other way round. Eastern Europeans were recruited to NATO as cannon fodder. That's why they were taken willingly and in bulk. If they were really going to be defended, the risks of expansion would have been assessed much more seriously. Now, our former socialist co-religionists, and now full members of the EU and NATO, look like a dog that accelerated and suddenly saw a failure in front of it. Instinctively, it starts to slow down, but realizes that it will not have time to stop. It should try to jump over, but it has already lost speed and will not be able to gain the necessary acceleration for a jump. The dog's eyes are panic-stricken, but it is doomed to jump forward, as it cannot stop. Poland is especially close to this state, which has always proudly jumped ahead of everyone else, and now finds itself in a situation when the reform of the army and its twofold increase are only in the plans. Weapons have been ordered but, except for tanks, have not even started to arrive yet. The USA categorically refuses to start a nuclear war because of Warsaw, and the decision to invade Ukraine must be made in the next couple of months. Then it will be too late, and it is impossible to refuse the invasion. The return of the ancestral Polish lands is too much publicized. The only thing left for the Polish barbos is to let out a confident GAV, which turns into a pitiful squeal, push off harder and jump after the Ukrainian B+ Obik, who also jumped recently, and now his carcass can be seen on the sharp stones at the bottom of the failure. There is no more NATO. The signboard is there, but there is no structure, because any treaties are valid only as long as they are favorable to all the countries that concluded them. Does it benefit the Americans to die for the Poles? Is a rhetorical question. Kennedy for Russia. There is an election coming up in the US. Now not only Western ex-politicians, but also some presidential candidates can afford to speak the truth to damage their rivals. Here, for example, is how President Kennedy's nephew is speaking out. The truth about the deplorable state of the armed forces of Ukraine is being hidden from the residents of the United States. At the same time, even the mainstream media recognize the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, wrote the US presidential candidate from the Democratic Party, Bernard Kennedy Jr. on his Twitter. The truth that Americans are not being told is that the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse, the politician said. Earlier, The Washington Post reported that, according to a classified U.S. intelligence forecast, the AFU will not be able to reach the key city of Melitopol. In addition, the assessment of U.S. agents led to scandals in closed-door meetings in Congress. The article said, Kennedy Jr. wondered whether Biden's neoconservatives would admit defeat and return to the idea of negotiations, or will they bring humanity a few steps closer to nuclear annihilation? Wondered the politician. Earlier, Kennedy Jr. said Washington financed the 2013-2014 Maidan protests. According to him, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is a front for the CIA, invested $5 billion in the protests. The politician recalled that later these actions led to a coup d'état, sanctions on emotions. The blogger Vanitas Vanit writes about the poor quality of decision-making by Western politicians. It seems that many decisions, including those on sanctions and other actions against Russia, were made not as a result of any careful analysis and forecasting, but rather spontaneously on emotion. Professional politicians, especially modern ones, should probably not be trusted to make any responsible decisions after all. Real, not ostentatious. Politics is done behind the scenes and is a struggle between elites or certain influential groups of elites. These are the serious uncles to think, not the politicians. However, in some situations, there is no time for long-term thinking that is the result. Influence on business in general as a slingshot on the squares. The effect can be given by influencing the above-mentioned influential groups within the elites. For it is doubtful that in Russia Putin personally decides everything, and all others only look at his mouth. Very doubtful. So the goal was probably to influence the elite. But for it to be effective, one must have a clear idea of the current configuration of these very elites. In real political life, this is extremely valuable information, which should be provided by intelligence. And if there is no doubt that in the 1990s or early noughties Western intelligence services had enough adequate informants, it seems that now they have certain problems with it. In any case, the available leaks in recent years make us think so. If in the States they consider an event manager from the presidential administration to be a valuable informant after all, they organized his escape to the USA, then what can we think about? Well, what information other than anecdotes and gossip from smoking rooms could he provide, given the fact that his official duties included organizing corporate parties, New Year performances for employees' children, and so on? Of course, good analysts, even from anecdotes and fishing stories, can extract useful information, but still the question arises, do Western intelligence services really have information about real Russian politics, reflecting the current situation, not the one that took place 20 years ago? I have information, don't ask me where from, that almost all sanctions imposed against Russia are being successfully circumvented, and the way they are being circumvented is well known to all parties concerned, and everyone is basically happy with this situation. I can only interpret this as a reaction of those very serious uncles who determine the real policy well. It is necessary to somehow stop the nonsense committed by unreasonable children who claim to be the leaders of states.